Well, hello everyone, and good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to this event on working in think tanks. I'm just introducing the session. I'll introduce myself to start with. I'm Paul Johnson. I'm director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and I spent the majority of my life actually working in the IFS. And I just wanted to say a few words about why and about the think tank world in general. There are an awful lot of think tanks around, probably vastly more than you can possibly name. Some of us, I hope, are reasonably well known. Some are rather less high profile, but nevertheless can be quite influential. They cover the whole range of issues, from the economics of public policy like the IFS to more macroeconomic things like the National Institute, health, Nuffield Trust, and others, education, foreign affairs, justice issues, pretty much everything that you can imagine in the political, economic, and social science world. Why do we exist? Well, we exist, I think, for in one sense, just to help the world be a better place. Think tanks are there to some extent hold governments to account, to do research, and to inform the wider population. There are different kinds of think tanks in that sense. Some are explicitly politically aligned in one direction or another. Some, like the IFS, are very explicitly not politically aligned in any direction. If you're thinking of working in one, you probably want some sense of what kind they are. Some are, like the IFS, very much unidisciplinary. We only employ economists in terms of our research staff. Others are more broad-based. Some will clearly want specific skills in some areas, whether it be quantitative areas or in terms of knowledge and understanding of particular parts of policy. We also translate work which goes on in the university sector into a format which is more useful for the policy-making sector. You can, to some extent, see think tanks not only doing research, but also being a conduit between the university research sector and the policy world, the civil service, and politicians. Why think about think tanks? Well, partly I think they offer you the best of both worlds, the best of what happens in academia. You actually get to do really good, high quality, interesting research, and the best of what happens in the civil service and among policymakers. And you also get to really impact on things. But with relative to the civil service or public policy, you've got a lot more freedom. You've got a lot more capacity to make your own agenda. You can say things in public, and you don't have to work in a great big bureaucracy. Some people like working in bureaucracies. Think tanks are not bureaucratic. They're small organizations on the whole. If you enjoy working in small organizations, they're for you. And relative to universities, again, actually, you have often more freedom. You have more impact. You can have a broader set of things that you're focused on. I've certainly found working in think tanks a phenomenal career choice. Most of my colleagues do as well. And you go on. Few people do what I've done and spend the majority of their career working in a single think tank. Most will go on to great jobs elsewhere. So if you're thinking of it as a first career move, it's a brilliant stepping stone into public policy, into the civil service or politics, if you want, into the media, into consultancy, into academia, and indeed into many parts of the private sector. So it's a fantastic thing to do at the beginning of your career, and also something that's very good to do for longer periods as well. I could go on and on, but I have only been allocated 5 minutes. I'll just end by saying again how pleased I am to see so many people who are listening to this. Nearly 300 according to my screen. I hope you're all thinking seriously about the kinds of great things that you can do in the think tank world, do think about the particular kind of organization that might suit you best, and do bring your insights, your experience, your knowledge, what you've learnt to what I think genuinely is actually a really important part of British constitutional life. We hold collectively government to account, we inform government, we inform the population, and on the whole, I think, and future speakers may speak to this, I think we have quite a lot of fun while we do it. And I will now hand over to Nicola Blacklaws, who is chairing the event.
Fab. Thanks so much, Paul. That was a really useful kind of overview and pitch for the sector. And I also just wanted to echo him by welcome everybody who's tuning in today, and it's so great to see that we've got so many of you with us. As Paul said, my name is Nicola Blacklaws. I work for a think tank called the Institute for Government, and I'll be at the helm for the rest of this session. Before I hand over to our next excellent speaker, some very brief housekeeping stuff to mention. There are lots of different organisations involved in this event, and they all have different ways of working and focus on different policy areas across all the different panels that follow this session. And what we're trying to do today is give you an insight into the sector and to possible career paths within it. So it might not be possible necessarily to answer kind of specific detailed questions about particular organisations in the sessions today, but what we hope is to give you a flavour of the think tank sector and what working in a think tank might look like. Also wanted to flag that in the information pack you've all received with the Zoom links in to this session and all the other sessions, there's a link to an equal opportunities form. And if you haven't already filled it out and have a second after the event, we'd be really grateful if you did. It's only very short, and it just helps us to analyse the reach of the event and helps us to plan our future outreach. So for the rest of this session, we have two speakers. We have Matt Whitaker, who's the CEO of Pro Bono Economics, and Emily Redding, who is the Director of Smart Thinking. Matt is going to give an overview, introduction to think tanks and the wider sector, and then we will take a few questions from you, from the audience, and then Emily is going to talk a little bit about applying for jobs in the sector, and then she will take some questions as well. In terms of how the Q&A will work, you can either type your questions into the chat, and feel free to do that as we go along as things occur to you, or when it gets to the Q&A part of the session, you can use the raise hand button, and I'll call out your name and our excellent event support team will unmute you, and you can ask your question that way. But if you'd rather not speak in front of loads of faceless Zoom people, please feel free to ask your questions in the chat. And after this session, as you'll have seen in your information pack, we're all going to split off into a series of smaller, more focused sessions, and you can choose which ones to attend of those based on what you're most interested in. So now, with all of that out of the way, I will hand over to Matt. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Really delighted to be here. I'm going to share my screen because, like all good think tankers, I love a slide pack. I don't even read my kids a bedtime story at night without slides. So hopefully it will help me order my thoughts too. Just a quick introduction then, as Nicola says, I run something called Pro Bono Economics, and we are not a think tank. We're actually a charity that exists to, as the name would suggest, provide pro bono economic support to other charities. But we have, over the last 2 years, added a think tank element to what we do. So we now do research and policy analysis and work that is looking to highlight what the charity sector does and bring an economic lens to that, and to help mainstream it in the policy debate in a way that it perhaps hasn't been before. And the reason we've done that over the last 2 years, and the reason that I've been involved in that, is because I spent 11 years prior to that working in the Resolution Foundation think tank. So I do have that think tank background, and Pro Bono Economics wanted to use some of that capability in order to sort of build a policy platform for itself. Prior to Resolution, I worked in Parliament for 5 years, and prior to that in economic consultancy. So I've had a range of jobs around what might be considered the sort of the policy making world, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But happily, I think everything I've got in this slide pack is sort of chimes pretty closely with what Paul was saying at the start in terms of this introduction to what think tanks do and what the ecosystem looks like. So that is helpful. So what do they do? I think first and foremost, they identify problems. What do I mean by that? Through a range of methods, they might highlight issues which are of concern or should be of concern to the policy-making world or to the public more generally, to politicians, to the media, and so on and so forth. So they might use data analysis and modelling, sort of what-if type analysis. Inflation's really high at the moment. What does that mean? Who's going to be affected? How are they going to be affected? How long for? We can use data to get into some of that. Some of that data is already available. Some of it needs to be created. So they might run surveys and do primary research. Some of it is numbers and quantitative, but also really important is qualitative information. So what's public opinion telling us? What about if we run some focus groups to understand what matters to people and what they think that we should be doing as a country or as a locality or as a globe even. And some of it, as Paul says, builds really very sort of directly on academic research. But all of it is building towards this idea of, okay, what are the problems? What are the issues facing the policy community? That alone is not a think tank. A think tank also wants to suggest some solutions. How do they come up with those solutions? Again, a variety of means. So consultation, expert roundtables, bringing together the people who know more than we already know about this thing, getting them in a room. They should be talking to each other anyway. We can provide the platform where they do that talking, and then we can try and work out what to do off the back of that. Comparative analysis, so what do they do in other countries, basically, or in other parts of this country? What's the best practice that we might be able to steal from somewhere else and introduce into our context? Literature reviews, what do we know from evidence about what works and what doesn't work? And policy development more generally, so working within the think tank, can we throw ideas around so that we can start to say, not just here's a sort of general idea, somebody should do something, but in more concrete terms, okay, what does it cost? Who's going to deliver it? Who's going to pay for it? How do we measure success and failure? So there is that element to the think tank landscape too. And then I think to be a sort of completely rounded think tank, you want a final step, which is to persuade others to take action. And what does that mean? That means building relationships with policymakers and other key stakeholders. So it's not all necessarily about talking to government. It might be about talking to business or talking to the wider public, even changing hearts and minds and shifting attitudes. Often it means having a media presence, running events, being on broadcast, being in print press. And also it means running campaigns and influencing more generally. So that's sort of like direct taking things, not necessarily going through government, but directly campaigning for change in some form or other. So that's my sort of broad take on what think tanks do. This is just a collection of headlines just from the last month from articles which talk about what think tanks do. And as you can see, and again, speaking to Paul's point, it is extremely varied. So guidance gaps in relation to pensions, ESG regulation and greenwashing, fracking in Russia, UK poverty rising, insecure jobs for young people, retraining plumbers in order to be climate heroes, lots and lots of very different things, some of which you will care about, some of which you might not care about, some of which you'll agree with, some of which you won't agree with. But it is the think tank's job to have the space in order to do the thinking and to come up with the policy solutions, which government and others may or may not want to run with, but we help to inform public debate and broaden that debate. And we talk sometimes about the sort of the Westminster bubble. Here I'm talking about a bubble more generally, because this could be Westminster, national government, it could be local government, it could be, as I say, supranational, so it could be the EU, it could be the UN, it could be global. But if we think about the various of the ecosystem, if you like, the policy-making world, I think it's worth thinking about where think tanks fit in that. So at the heart of this, we've got government and policymakers. As I say, it's not all about influencing them, but they sit at the heart of this particular map, if you like. And then around that, I think you have a variety of actors. So businesses, charities, organizations more generally. You have the media, and at the bottom here, what I'm for the moment just going to call thinkers. And these different actors actually are really closely interconnected. So the route to influencing government is not necessarily direct every time. It might be through the media, it might be through business, It might be that you don't want to influence government on this particular occasion, you want to influence business. It might be that business wants to influence the media, or the media wants to influence business or the government. So there's a lot of interaction going on here, but this ecosystem is where think tankers exist, I think. And in particular, if we start to think about what this group of thinkers looks like, I often think about it as being a sort of a spectrum for think tanks. At the one end, you have the purely academic. It's about producing research that is increasing the sum of human knowledge and informing the public debate. But at the end of the day, you then walk away and you leave it where it is, and it's for others to take that up and to turn that into policy. At the other end of the spectrum, you have organizations which are all about campaigning. They have a particular thing which they care about, and actually you don't particularly need evidence to make the case. You know, abusing dogs is never good. You don't need evidence to prove that. So if you want to be a campaigning group that talks about ending abuse of dogs, then you can just go ahead and do that. You don't need necessarily to build evidence base around it. I think most think tanks would put themselves somewhere within the middle portion of this spectrum, but it is certainly true that think tanks exist across the spectrum. So some are more academic in what they do, more focused on producing really high quality research. Some are more campaigning, more focused on delivering change. Many try and do some of all of that. But there's also, again, Paul touched on this, a variety of different themes which think tanks might focus on. So you might be a think tank that focuses on a particular group of people, so older people, younger people, women, lots of different ways into that. You might be a think tank that focuses on a particular theme, so it might be poverty, it might be housing, it might be education or health. You might, as Paul says, be a think tank that is very explicitly politically motivated, the think tank of the centre left, the think tank of the centre right, a socialist think tank, a libertarian think tank, for instance. You might be a think tank which is representing the interests of your members. So your funding model might be that you are funded by a group of members who have a particular interest, and therefore your role is to work on behalf of those members in order to do research and build policy around the things that they care about. And it might be that you're a think tank that has a commercial offer. So it's more of a consultancy type model, where actually what you're doing is, if somebody wants to approach you and pay you to do something which you think is quite interesting and not morally reprehensible, then you're prepared to do it. But you don't necessarily have a theme that sits within that. You're just sort of experts in delivering a particular type of research and policy analysis, and therefore you work across a whole range of things. So lots of different types of think tanks, lots of different places along that spectrum, but also lots of different models. So one of the key questions is always, well, how are think tanks funded? Can be controversial at times. And the answer is in many different ways. So some have this sort of an endowment or a solo funder or philanthropic funding. So it may be that there's an individual, whether alive or indeed dead, who wants to put a significant amount of money into researching and developing the policy base around a particular theme. So all of those things we just looked at, whether it's older people, whether it's younger people, whether it's women, whether it's education, whether it's poverty, whether it's developing the sort of the think base around the centre left or the centre right. It might be that there's an individual that is funding that, or a group of individuals through philanthropic funding. It might be that you have research grants, so the organisations that exist in the UK to support high quality research and support the public debate that research can facilitate. They might provide funding for your think tank. You might go to commercial sponsors. So on a case-by-case basis, you might decide, I want to do some research on this particular thing, and therefore I'm going to go to this company to help me fund that. And that's not necessarily because the company has a particular commercial reason for wanting that research done, but it might be reputationally beneficial to them. It might be something which they just care about, which their board think that is the sort of topic they want to care about at the moment. As I say, this sort of more commercial think tank, you might have consultancy type contracts where you're producing, you're being paid for the work you're producing on a case-by-case basis. And it might be that you have some very close relation with a business, or with, Paul talked about this sort of the world of academia. Actually, increasingly universities have think tanks within their own institutions. So it may be that your financing comes through an institution that you're associated with, rather than you having to sort of seek it separately. So lots of different models, but also lots of different jobs. And I know Emily's going to get into this in a bit more detail, but going back to this idea of what do think tanks do, because it's such a varied picture, there's also a varied amount of jobs that exist around that. So classically, you might think about in terms of the sort of problem statement side of things. Who do we need there? We might need researchers or analysts, economists and statisticians, but also people who are just really good writers who can express a problem statement really clearly and succinctly, and qualitative researchers as well. So it's not just about crunching numbers, it is about being good with people and being able to run those focus groups and understand, have your finger on the pulse of what's going on, as it were. In terms of the sort of more solution-oriented side of things, then you want people who are policy experts or public affairs professionals. And actually, often you'll find within think tanks, there are people who are not necessarily employed directly by the think tank, but are in its sort of orbit. So fellows and advisors who help on coming up with the policy solutions. And then in terms of the persuading others to act bit, then as a think tank, you'll often be running events. So you want events managers. That media presence requires people who are good at working with the press, so press officers. Increasingly, of course, the digital and marketing side is really important. So there's the the social media side of things, and the having videos and GIFs and memes and all sorts of other ways of communicating the thing you want to communicate, and campaign coordinators more generally as well, depending on where you are on that think tank spectrum. And then within these think tanks, of course, there are organisations like any others. So there's a whole bunch of other jobs that need to be doing as well. So the fundraisers, the people that run the IT and the system side of things, HR, finance managers, all the people you'd expect to find in any organisation of any size. So a whole variety of jobs. And those jobs are actually also very interchangeable. So go back to that sort of idea of the policy bubble. Actually, I think lots of people work across all of these different areas over the course of their career. So we have our think tankers, yes, but there's quite a lot of crossover between think tankers and people who work in political parties or in campaign groups. Equally, crossover into academia and the civil service, trade associations more into the sort of private sector side of things, and public affairs within businesses, or just business more generally, particularly sort of, if you think about economists, people in my profession, there's a lot of crossover from people who work in finance and then come into the think tank because they want to make a difference. Over in terms of thinking about the sort of media side of things, there's a lot of crossover between people who are in the sort of policy commentary world and journalists, and actually also broadcast journalists. So there's a number of sort of pretty famous news journalists out there who cut their teeth in think tank world. So there's a lot of different areas that you can take this into. So I think it is a really sort of good, strong career choice. One I didn't know about when I was at university at all, had no idea about think tanks, stumbled my way into them, and I'm very happy that that's where I've ended up. And last of all, why do any of this? I think it is, as Paul said, a chance to make a difference ultimately. And these headlines, rather than being random ones from the last month, are 3 headlines which relate to 3 different policies that in different ways I've had some personal involvement with over the course of my think tank career. So that top one is talking about the national living wage, introduced in 2015. When I was at Resolution Foundation, we were cited by the Chancellor when he introduced this as being the sort of inspiration, the architects of this particular policy. And that is something which has increased the wages of millions of people up and down the country by thousands of pounds over the last 7 years. So it makes a meaningful difference to lots of people's lives. The second one actually is an example of almost the reverse of that. So it is not a policy that we recommended or created, but actually digging our heels in and providing the evidence, which meant something didn't happen. In this case, George Osborne, when he was Chancellor, was looking to put in place some cuts to tax credits. We produced lots of evidence and ran a campaign and worked with politicians and others to help convince him that that was not a good idea, because that was going to cost lots of people thousands of pounds a year, particularly single parents. And so by having him scrap that, again, we were able to make a meaningful change to lots of people's lives. And then more recently at Pro Bono Economics down at the bottom there, this was from Rishi Sunak's last budget, this idea of big investment in boosting the nation's skills base. I'm not going to claim the full 3.8 billion, but about £500 million was due to was pushed towards a campaign to improve adult numeracy. And again, in presenting that, the Chancellor directly cited some work that we've done at Pro Bono Economics as being evidence of why that was needed. So again, lots of things have to align for these things to come together and to have a policy impact. But when it does, you can look at it and say, actually, that's made a difference, and I'm really quite pleased with that. So I would definitely recommend a career in think tankery for anybody who is interested in making a difference and changing the world in whatever way they want to. But I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Matt. That was a really kind of comprehensive overview. There's been some stuff going on in the chat already, but I think what we might do with an eye on time is I might move straight on to Emily, if that's okay, and then we can maybe pick up questions at the very end. So if you're okay with that, Emily, I will hand over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Emily, I'm from Smart Thinking. Smart Thinking also isn't a think tank strictly. I set it up in 2017 and it's a one-stop shop for all things think tanks, so all their research, their events, their jobs, their internships. And actually most of the think tanks who feature in this event are one of our partners. We've now got 50 up on the site. But over the last 2 years, we've really developed our jobs pages. We have a dedicated interns and graduates page and also our careers resources. So I think that's why I was asked to speak, because I've seen a lot of what the think tanks and other policy organisations are looking for, what they're asking for. And I've spoken quite a lot at universities to give some sort of like top tips for applying. I actually started off in think tanks. I had a very roundabout route into them. So I actually graduated and joined KPMG and became an accountant. And then I went and did an internship after I qualified, and then got into think tanks that way. So there's lots of different ways. And like Matt was saying, there's a ton of different organizations to work in. There's lots of, it all emanates out from a starting point in think tanks. So it's lots to think about. But where should you start, I think, is the main question. And the best way to get your foot in the door and start getting some experience is with an internship. And internships have generally been the traditional way that think tanks have recruited a lot of their entry-level staff. So what I'm going to talk about now is about how to sort of help yourself to get that internship, but a lot of this will also apply to entry-level roles. For think tanks, it's just much easier for them to hire someone they've already worked with for 6 months who they know fits on their team well, than to go out and look for fresh candidates. And a lot of adverts we see on Smart Thinking often will say that there's a chance of a permanent role at the end of the internship. So where do you find them? Slight plug here, obviously Smart Thinking has a dedicated interns and graduates page that not only contains a lot of careers resources, but also lists a variety of current internships up for grabs, and not just from think tanks. At the moment, I think we've got one from think tanks, and there's like 4 different communications agencies that are looking for comms people. But other places to look would be to sign up to some of your favorite think tanks mailing lists and follow them on Twitter, as they'll often then share when the applications are opening up. So that's quite a good way of getting a heads up. Just in some general information about internships. Internships are now, thankfully, generally paid, and more often than not at the living wage, which obviously Matt had some hand in now. And it's a big improvement on even a few years ago when many were not paid at all. They vary in length from a few weeks to a few months to some that are a full year. And generally you will need to be in the office at least for part of the week. Many, if not most, are London based, but not all, and it's all a bit more flexible since the pandemic. So when I started in think tanks, literally no one worked from home, but now they've all had to adapt and offer some sort of flexible working. Most internships are offered through formal applications, and I'll discuss these now, but I'll touch on speculative applications later on, because whenever I speak at one of these events, I always get asked about speculative approaches. So how to give your application the best chance? So basically, excellent written skills. I cannot stress this enough. Quite a few of the think tanks don't even use CVs as the first filter when recruiting for interns. They'll set, for example, 800-word piece on a topic and pick the best written, and only then look at CVs. So if you're thinking of think tanks as a possible career, and in particular of research and comms, then take every opportunity to practice, be that on your student paper, a blog, anything that hones this skill. And I actually interviewed a former head of research last week who I used to work with about what he looks for in candidates. And I'm going to quote him because I think he sums up the written issue really well and much better than I ever could, and had some good practical advice, because I know it's easy to say, oh, just improve your written skills. And that's not actually that helpful when looking at how you actually do that. So what he says, I asked him, what would you tell people wanting to work in this sector? And he said, the thing I always say to people is to start thinking like a policy thinker when you're applying for that job, and as far as possible, write about it. Every time there's an issue you're interested in, think about how you would respond if you were asked about it from a policy perspective, and write that down. Keep your own blog. You don't have to publish it, but I always want to see samples of writing from people. An example question in the papers at the moment is a potential cancellation of the planned national insurance rise. What are the policy consequences of that? What's your policy take on that? What does it mean for public finances? Write about it as if you were if you could be a columnist, but a thoughtful columnist. Don't write as a teacher, don't write as a politician, don't write it as an undergrad or postgrad essay. So that's just kind of give you a flavour of some of the things you could be thinking about right now to put yourself in a good position. And aside from written skills, there are other important things you can do to get yourself into a good position as well. Firstly, get good grades. It's a small sector and very competitive. And I don't say that to put you off, but it is important to boost your chances in any way possible. Demonstrate an interest in politics and policy. If you're applying, then it means you're interested, but make sure you read around, read the broadsheets, get an idea of what the big policy issues are, and crucially start thinking about issues in policy terms, like Jonathan mentioned. He said one of the challenges he thinks that the think tank sector is facing is we don't really study policy as a discipline. So graduates coming out of university haven't had that. He actually studied politics at uni, haven't had that thing where they've started to think about it. And he said it is a discipline and it is something you do have to learn and pick up. So he's always be trying to think about things in the policy terms and find an area that you get excited about. It might not be the one you end up working on, especially if you work in some of the smaller, more broader institutions. But for example, if you find housing policy really fascinating, then read up on it, form some opinions, and be prepared to show that interest in an application or an interview. So an interview with the director I used to work for at one of the think tanks, it would often feel like a total grilling. And I think one interview one poor girl had was basically just a discussion on the pasty tax, which shows my age. I think that was a budget many years ago. And it wasn't that he was trying to catch you out, and he didn't have to agree with what you were saying or, agree with your arguments, but he wanted to see you were engaged on a policy issue, no matter how small or niche, or even if you'd never thought of the issue before, that you could kind of comprehend and come up with a position yourself. And so when so many people say they're passionate on an application, you need to really be able to show that you are interested. And I've talked a lot about writing, but the other skills and experience that think tanks value, which often people overlook and think they shouldn't include, are for non-research roles. If you've worked at a society or a club at uni, you've perhaps raised money or served on a social committee. It's all experience think tanks will like, especially if you're looking at, say, a fundraising role or an events role. And also think about other skills you may have developed that will be of real interest to a think tank, especially to the smaller ones with smaller budgets. So perhaps you have experience editing podcasts or videos. Maybe you have some skill at handling large data sets. Think about all that you can do and tease out any skills that you can highlight especially to the smaller think tanks, because you might be surprised at their response. They're always looking for people who all hands on deck. So there's no harm in kind of raising those. And have a clear idea of why you want to work for a think tank. So I think this is something that often people forget, but know what the think tank you're applying to, know what it focuses on, know what they are known for. You would think this is fairly standard, but from a lot of what a lot of think tanks have told me, it's really horribly not. So, as Paul and Matt were saying, think tanks are generally non-political, but you should know where they broadly sit on the political spectrum. And you don't necessarily have to agree with everything they've ever written. But if you are more on the progressive side of politics, then you might not be comfortable working for a free market think tank. And it's good to think about these things at this stage, rather than go through the process of applying and then realize it's maybe not for you. But essentially, you just need to conduct a thorough research of the think tank you're applying to, especially if you get called to interview. Look at their recent research, have a look at a couple of their reports, know who sits on the board, perhaps attend one of their online events just to get a feel for who they are and how they do things. And then in general, just some really short, quick fire tips. I feel like I'm bombarding you with tips now, but this is what we've gathered. Just start applying to anything and everything. It's generally easier to get into fundraising and events than research, but be careful when you're applying for the job that you say you want the job you're applying for. I worked briefly on a fundraising team, and we would ask people, why fundraising? And they would say, oh, well, I want to be in research, but I couldn't get in there. That is not a good thing to say in an interview for a fundraising position. People used to say go to events and network, and I really think that puts off a lot of people. I would say in my experience, it's not networking that will get your foot in the door. It's not nepotism, it's not knowing people. It's actually the think tanks have worked really hard to make it really open and fair. And so I'd say go to events just to kind of get an understanding of what the think tanks are like, And, you know, if you're interested in a particular policy area, that can be quite fun. But I'd say think tank events, especially now that online, you actually can't really do that much networking. But in general, think tank events are great to go and network once you're inside a think tank and you're starting to build that network. But don't worry if you are outside London or you're not going to events, it doesn't have much of an impact on that. You can also make a speculative approach. So usually roles are given out through formal internships, but if you're not having much joy in that route, then you can always have a think about how you can approach them separate to that. My advice to this would be research exactly who you should approach. So if it's a big think tank, then it might be the head of the policy area that you're interested in. If it's a smaller one, it might be the director of research or the head of events or the head of fundraising. And be very clear on your ask. Is it 20 minutes of their time to ask their advice on how to get into think tanks? Maybe it's to shadow a team member or a week's work experience. Highlight what it is that about that specific think tank you like and what you could help with, including all those random other skills I just mentioned. And, you know, because lots of people, they're very generous, especially in think tanks, they're very generous with their time. They're happy to help. They want to open the sector to as many people as possible. But just be very clear, you know, these are very busy people. So be clear, like, I just need 20 minutes to ask some questions. Maybe it can be online now. You know, it's a lot easier nowadays, what with the pandemic and everyone being used to doing stuff online. But just have a think, if you're not having much joy in the formal route, that is also something to think about. Join our mailing list. We have a weekly newsletter that goes out every Saturday morning, which has the latest internships and jobs. So you might get a head start from that. And finally, which is a really boring thing to end on, but make sure you have spelt everything correctly and have all your details right. I was on a panel a few years ago with someone from Chatham House who gets hundreds and thousands of applications every year. And he said he had this great CV, Cambridge University, looked like he was just going to be a perfect fit to Chatham. Rang the mobile number to invite him to interview, was the wrong number. CV went straight into the bin. So make sure, double, triple check everything, because you don't want to have spent all this time crafting the perfect CV, the perfect application, and then never hear anything because you got your mobile phone number wrong. And that was it. Sorry, it's a whistle-stop tour.
Fantastic. That you covered an immense amount of stuff there, actually. And we've got absolutely tons of questions in the chat, but I'm conscious that the next set of panels starts in 7 minutes. So we're not going to be able to get through all of them, but I think what we will do is collect FAQs after the event's finished, and we'll circulate them along with the recordings of all the panels. But there are a couple of things I want to pick up on very quickly. The first one is there have been a few people asking about whether you need postgraduate degrees to kind of get a foothold in think tanks. My instinctual reaction is no, but do you think that, Emily and Matt, do you think that's about right? Yes, yeah. Nodding.
Yeah, I know, well, Matt will know better than me because he's worked for a long time in research, but I know there are people with postgrad degrees, but a lot of people, especially in the more domestic and less quantitative roles, often have just an undergrad degree.
Yeah, I mean, speaking personally, I've only got an undergraduate degree, and something I've definitely learned over the years of recruiting lots of people into think tanks is you can teach technical skills and you can encourage and develop communication skills. What you can't teach is passion. And so actually, in many ways, the most important thing is that people come into this because, as I said before, they want to make a difference. And if you are determined to do that, you know, and you've got a bit about you and you're prepared to learn, then you've got every chance.
Nice, thank you. I feel there is absolutely shed loads of questions in the chat, but I think we're going to have to wrap up because I want you all to be able to be on time for the next set of panels. So as I said at the beginning, the rest of this event is split up into 6 sessions over the next couple of hours with panels that will dig into some of the more specific aspects of working in think tanks that will actually speak to a lot of the questions that have been asked in the chat now. Some of those sessions are running concurrently, but recordings of all of them are going to be available afterwards. And we'll send links around to everybody. So the next 2 panels are starting at 4:45, so in 5 minutes. Session 2A is on influencing policy and session 2B is on communications, media and events. Sessions 3A and 3B will start at 5:20 and the final pair of sessions will start at 5:55, and links to all of those sessions are in the information pack. So I'd just like to thank Paul and Matt and Emily again for their contributions to this session, and all of you for tuning in. And hopefully we'll see you in the next set of sessions in a couple of minutes. Thanks so much.